Shielding of misconduct. Critics of the Peace Officer Bill of Rights argue that one of its most problematic outcomes is the inadvertent shielding of misconduct, making it more difficult for departments, oversight bodies, and the public to identify and address inappropriate behavior within police ranks. While proponents maintain that POBR statutes are essential for ensuring officers receive due process and fair treatment, detractors counter that these frameworks create layers of procedural complexity and secrecy that can hamper efforts to hold law enforcement personnel accountable. A primary concern centers on the procedural safeguards that POBR provisions establish. Although these measures are intended to prevent arbitrary or politically motivated discipline, their practical effect may be to impede thorough and timely investigations. Requirements such as advance written notice before interrogations, strict limitations on when and how questioning can occur, and restrictions on the type of evidence that can be presented in disciplinary proceedings can collectively reduce the flexibility investigators need. By prescribing rigid, step-by-step procedures, POBR statutes can slow investigations to a crawl, discouraging a comprehensive review of alleged misconduct. In turn, this can allow problematic officers to remain in service longer than they otherwise would, potentially perpetuating a cycle of misconduct. Another aspect of the shielding effect arises from the confidentiality provisions often embedded within POBR laws. Personnel files, internal affairs records, and other documents critical for establishing patterns of misconduct are frequently protected from public disclosure. While advocates argue that shielding these records upholds officer privacy rights, critics contend that it comes at a significant cost to transparency and accountability. Without access to an officer's prior disciplinary history, prosecutors, civil litigants, and even defense attorneys in criminal cases may be unable to demonstrate patterns of dishonest testimony or excessive force. These evidentiary blind spots can lead to investigative stalemates and weak cases, making it difficult to remove officers who engage in repeated wrongdoing. The cumulative effect of procedural hurdles and confidentiality clauses is often most pronounced when viewed through a systemic lens. Even if the intent of POBR legislation is not to conceal misconduct, the interplay of these rules can produce an environment in which misconduct is effectively shielded. For example, an officer who has faced multiple complaints over several years may never be subjected to a truly transparent evaluation of their conduct if each investigation is burdened by procedural delays and incomplete disclosure of information. Absent accountability, a problematic officer may continue to interact with the public, potentially eroding community trust and increasing the likelihood of further incidents. Critics also note that the shielding of misconduct under POBR frameworks can undermine the deterrent effect of disciplinary proceedings. When officers perceive that the system is weighted heavily in their favor, such that complaints are not vigorously pursued, evidence is difficult to access, and punishments are often reduced through arbitration, they may feel less pressure to adhere strictly to departmental policies or constitutional standards. Over time, this dynamic can contribute to a departmental culture that tolerates or downplays misconduct rather than actively rooting it out. This is not to say that the majority of officers would deliberately engage in wrongdoing because of POBR protections, but rather that the absence of effective accountability mechanisms can weaken the normative constraints that help keep misconduct in check. The shielding effect has gained increasing public attention in recent years due to high-profile cases of misconduct that have come to light despite POBR-related barriers. Civil rights organizations, journalists, and community activists have highlighted instances where officers with known patterns of excessive force or dishonest behavior were allowed to continue serving. In some of these cases, lengthy and convoluted disciplinary processes, coupled with stringent confidentiality rules, prevented stakeholders from detecting and addressing the underlying problems. As a result, public outrage has mounted, fueling calls for reform and the re-examination of POBR statutes. In response, some states and municipalities have begun to modify or repeal portions of their POBR legislation to reduce the shielding effect. Reforms have included granting limited public access to certain disciplinary records, streamlining administrative appeals, and narrowing the permissible scope of confidentiality clauses. While these efforts often face resistance from police unions and some law enforcement officials who argue that officers deserve robust procedural protections, the momentum for change indicates growing recognition that POBR's shielding of misconduct is not sustainable if the goal is to maintain public trust in policing. Critics also emphasize that shielding misconduct does not only harm victims and communities, it can adversely affect good officers who value integrity and fairness. When wrongdoing goes unpunished and problem officers are allowed to remain on the force, morale can suffer among those who strive to uphold professional standards. A perceived double standard, where some officers seem above the law due to procedural advantages, can breed resentment and reduce teamwork and trust within departments. Ultimately, the controversy surrounding the shielding of misconduct under POBR frameworks reflects a broader tension between protecting individual officers' rights and ensuring robust oversight of law enforcement institutions. On one hand, few would deny that officers, tasked with a difficult and sometimes dangerous job, deserve due process protections against unfounded allegations. On the other hand, a system that overcorrects in favor of officer protections risks sacrificing the core principle of accountability essential to legitimate policing. As public demands for transparency and fairness intensify, legislatures and courts will likely continue to grapple with how to recalibrate POBR provisions. In doing so, they must confront the realities of how shielding misconduct not only undermines faith in the justice system, but also hinders the very concept of public service that policing is meant to embody. Challenges to transparency and accountability. Critics of the Peace Officer Bill of Rights have frequently identified diminished transparency and compromised accountability as major points of contention. While supporters of POBR argue that its provisions are necessary to safeguard the due process rights of law enforcement officers, detractors maintain that the legal scaffolding it creates can impede access to information, shield misconduct from public scrutiny, and ultimately erode trust in the policing profession. These challenges to transparency and accountability have been the subject of ongoing debate among policymakers, civil society organizations, legal scholars, and community leaders. The structural barriers to transparency embedded in POBR frameworks are often evident in the confidentiality clauses governing personnel records, disciplinary proceedings, and internal affairs investigations. These clauses typically limit the scope and speed at which critical information can be released to the public, the media, or even prosecutors and defense attorneys in criminal cases. The consequence is that key documents, such as officers' prior disciplinary records, complaints filed against them, and the results of internal investigations, remain shielded from external review. As a result, community members, civil rights groups, and journalists face significant challenges when attempting to evaluate the performance and integrity of their local police departments. Such constraints on transparency are not merely abstract matters of legal procedure. They have practical implications for how misconduct is identified, understood, and addressed. When investigative files remain largely out of reach, it becomes more difficult to detect patterns of excessive force, dishonest testimony, or harassment within a department. Without a clear view of the underlying facts, policymakers struggle to craft informed reforms. Oversight boards cannot provide rigorous supervision, and the public is left relying on partial or anecdotal accounts of wrongdoing. Ultimately, this opacity undermines the impetus for systemic changes that might prevent future abuses of power. Another criticism linked to the transparency issue is that POBR provisions can distort accountability mechanisms within police departments. The structured timelines for internal investigations, extensive procedural requirements for interrogations, and the restricted admissibility of certain evidence can conspire to make it more challenging to hold officers accountable for their actions. Although these measures are justified by proponents as safeguards against hasty or politicized discipline, in practice they often serve to delay or weaken the ability of departments to impose meaningful sanctions. In this environment, officers who repeatedly engage in problematic behavior may evade rigorous consequences due to procedural entanglements rather than factual innocence. Over time, this can create a perception, if not a reality, of a double standard, where law enforcement officers operate under a protective shield unavailable to most other public servants or private citizens. The interplay between secrecy and accountability also affects broader public confidence in the criminal justice system. Policing relies heavily on community cooperation and trust. When allegations surface that POBR rules have prevented the disclosure of key evidence in cases where officers stand accused of misconduct, the public may begin to doubt that the legal system treats all individuals equally. If community members perceive that officers are exempt from the scrutiny and consequences that apply to ordinary citizens, skepticism and frustration can solidify into deep-seated mistrust. Such sentiment can have long-term repercussions, including diminished willingness to report crimes, cooperate with investigations, or serve as witnesses, ultimately hindering the effectiveness of law enforcement itself. Moreover, challenges to transparency and accountability under POBR have reverberations in the courtroom. When attorneys on both sides cannot access comprehensive disciplinary histories or internal investigation findings, the adversarial process that underpins the judicial system is compromised. Defense attorneys representing individuals accused of crimes may be unable to impeach an officer's credibility with evidence of prior misconduct. Similarly, prosecutors may find themselves unable to meet constitutional obligations to disclose exculpatory or impeachment evidence if they cannot obtain it in the first place. As a result, trials may occur without the full evidentiary record, raising questions about the fairness and integrity of verdicts and settlements. Public discourse around these issues has intensified as high-profile cases and national protests have drawn attention to policing practices. Civil society groups, journalists, and community activists have increasingly scrutinized POBR statutes, arguing that reforms are needed to enhance disclosure and ensure that accountability frameworks are effective rather than merely symbolic. Proposals have included amending POBR laws to allow greater public access to disciplinary records, creating independent oversight bodies with subpoena power, and streamlining procedures to ensure that misconduct allegations are resolved promptly and transparently. While these efforts face resistance from those who argue that officer morale and privacy would be jeopardized, the growing appetite for reform indicates that the status quo is no longer widely acceptable. Furthermore, legal scholars have explored the comparative impacts of varying POBR implementations. In jurisdictions that have taken steps to lift some of the secrecy provisions or relax stringent procedural hurdles, observers have noted modest improvements in transparency and accountability. By contrast, states or municipalities that maintain rigid protections and confidentiality rules continue to grapple with criticisms that their accountability mechanisms are unduly weighted in favor of the officer, rather than the public interest. This comparative dynamic suggests that the issues are neither unsolvable nor inevitable, but rather products of specific policy choices that can be revisited and revised. In conclusion, the criticisms and controversies surrounding POBR highlight profound challenges to transparency and accountability in policing. While the original intent behind these statutes was to safeguard officers from arbitrary discipline and uphold due process, the cumulative effect has often been to insulate misconduct from public scrutiny, complicate internal accountability processes, and strain relationships between law enforcement and the communities they serve. As debate continues, the ultimate question is how to recalibrate these frameworks so that legitimate protections for officers do not come at the expense of the very transparency and accountability that underpin public trust in the justice system. Counterarguments from law enforcement advocates. Law enforcement advocates who support the Peace Officer Bill of Rights, POBR, often offer a range of counterarguments in response to the numerous criticisms and controversies surrounding these statutes. While acknowledging that no system is perfect, these proponents maintain that POBR provisions are integral to ensuring equitable treatment, procedural fairness, and stability within the policing profession. They argue that public debates frequently overlook the historical context in which POBR laws were enacted and the complex realities officers face in their daily work. By situating their defense within the broader framework of labor rights, organizational morale, professional standards, and public safety, Law enforcement advocates attempt to counter narratives that portray POBR solely as a mechanism for shielding misconduct or stifling accountability. A central theme in the arguments put forth by supporters is that POBR statutes serve a critical function similar to those in other professions where employees operate under stressful and publicly scrutinized conditions. Officers are often expected to make rapid, life-altering decisions in unpredictable, high-pressure situations. According to law enforcement advocates, procedural safeguards protect officers from being subjected to capricious discipline, political scapegoating, and media-driven condemnation. From their perspective, without POBR provisions, officers could find themselves vulnerable to whimsical administrative actions, unfair demotions, or unjustified terminations influenced by shifting political winds rather than objective assessments of performance. Within this narrative, POBR protections are likened to the legal safeguards afforded to other public employees or workers in high-risk industries. Proponents point to teachers, firefighters, and civil servants who have secured due process protections through collective bargaining and statutory frameworks. They argue that law enforcement officers, who carry immense responsibilities and face profound personal risks, deserve at least the same degree of fairness. Indeed, they contend that the nature of police work, where accusations can arise from emotionally charged incidents and where media attention may bias public perception, warrants especially clear procedural guidelines. Such guidelines ensure that officers are not penalized without a thorough and principled review of evidence. Another key counterargument is that POBR statutes foster a stable and professional workforce. Law enforcement advocates suggest that, absent these protections, talented officers might be deterred from pursuing long-term careers in policing. They argue that the knowledge that disciplinary actions will follow transparent, consistent rules, even if such rules may occasionally slow investigations, contributes to retention, morale, and overall organizational cohesion. In this view, POBR provisions function as part of a broader system of checks and balances that reassure officers that their employers will not discard them due to unverified accusations or political pressure. This reassurance, it is argued, ultimately benefits the public by maintaining a more experienced and committed police force. Furthermore, supporters emphasize that POBR statutes do not preclude accountability. Rather, they channel it through structured, due process-oriented frameworks. Law enforcement advocates acknowledge that officers who engage in misconduct must be disciplined or removed from service, but insist that disciplinary decisions should not be made hastily. They argue that the formal procedures mandated by POBR ensure that any penalty imposed is rooted in a full examination of the facts, preventing knee-jerk reactions or decisions influenced by media sensationalism or emotional public outcry. By insisting on proper investigative steps and interviews, they believe that POBR laws elevate the quality of decision-making, reduce the risk of errors, and thereby bolster the legitimacy of disciplinary outcomes once they are reached. In addition, proponents counterclaims that POBR standards impede transparency by pointing to the nuanced balance between disclosure and privacy rights. They note that officers, like other employees, have legitimate privacy interests in their personnel records. Officers, after all, are not merely public officials, but also individuals with personal lives and reputations at stake. Law enforcement advocates argue that blanket public disclosure of disciplinary records without procedural safeguards could result in unfair stigmatization of officers who may have been cleared of wrongdoing or faced minor, context-dependent infractions. From their standpoint, the constraints on disclosure imposed by POBR laws are not intended to conceal patterns of egregious misconduct. Rather, they are meant to ensure that the release of information is proportional, accurate, and respects fundamental fairness. Proponents also contend that many criticisms overlook the vital role that police unions and legal counsel play in shaping POBR provisions. The negotiation of these statutes often involves complex discussions between union representatives, department leadership, and elected officials. Law enforcement advocates maintain that the resulting frameworks reflect a consensus or compromise, not a unilateral imposition. By incorporating the perspectives of those who understand the demands of policing firsthand, POBR laws strive to create workable guidelines that safeguard officers' rights and maintain organizational discipline. In this sense, law enforcement supporters present POBR as a product of democratic, labor-oriented processes rather than a covert tool designed to thwart accountability. Moreover, some law enforcement advocates challenge the assumption that POBR protections inherently shield wrongdoing. They argue that when the procedures are followed correctly, officers who commit egregious acts of misconduct can and are removed from service. In their view, the problem lies not in the existence of procedural safeguards, but in the occasional misuse or misinterpretation of these rules, or in agencies that fail to apply them rigorously. Advocates thus shift the focus away from POBR per se and highlight the need for better training, stronger internal affairs units, and more effective oversight at the departmental level. By improving the implementation of existing procedures rather than dismantling POBR protections, they believe it is possible to achieve accountability without undermining due process. Law enforcement advocates also point to empirical data and case studies that suggest POBR protections do not necessarily correlate with increased misconduct. Rather, they may argue that thorough procedural safeguards can improve the overall quality of police work. Officers who feel secure in their rights are, according to this line of reasoning, more likely to cooperate fully with investigations, participate in candid self-assessments, and engage in training opportunities to enhance their skills. Advocates assert that environments marked by clarity and fairness encourage officers to report misconduct by peers, knowing that their allegations will be assessed through a reputable and unbiased process. Far from enabling misconduct, they argue, POBR structures have the potential to create a culture of accountability from within. Additionally, proponents highlight that in an era marked by intense scrutiny of policing, POBR laws serve as a stabilizing factor that can prevent overcorrections driven by public outrage following tragic or controversial incidents. Without these guidelines, they caution, departments and city officials might respond to public pressure by meting out discipline precipitously, even when circumstances are complex or allegations unsubstantiated. POBR, therefore, is presented as a safeguard against policymaking driven by fleeting emotions rather than evidence-based reasoning. This perspective casts POBR not as a rejection of accountability, but as a means to ensure that accountability measures are sustainable, credible, and reflective of impartial judgment rather than political expediency. In response to calls for reform, law enforcement advocates do not necessarily oppose adjustments to POBR frameworks, but caution against dismantling essential protections. They may support carefully calibrated reforms that clarify timelines, improve data sharing agreements, or create appropriate oversight bodies capable of reviewing disciplinary actions while preserving core due process rights. The emphasis, from their perspective, is on refining rather than discarding POBR structures. By making incremental changes that address legitimate concerns about transparency and accountability, such as allowing limited public access to substantiated findings of misconduct, they believe it is possible to respond to critics' demands without eroding the fundamental fairness that POBR guarantees. Ultimately, law enforcement advocates contend that the most effective way to reconcile POBR with accountability is through cooperation and dialogue. Rather than framing the debate as a zero-sum struggle between public oversight and officer protections, they call for nuanced policy discussions that involve all stakeholders. By bringing together community representatives, legal experts, elected officials, police unions, and department leaders, it may be possible to craft solutions that maintain the positive aspects of POBR, its due process safeguards, morale benefits, and professional standards, while mitigating the negative consequences that critics highlight. Indeed, the presence of reasoned counterarguments from law enforcement advocates ensures that the conversation over POBR remains complex, reflecting the multifaceted nature of policing and the delicate balancing act required to promote both just treatment of officers and robust accountability to the public they serve.